Welcome, everyone. We would like to welcome you to another webinar session with the NetHope Solutions Center. My name is Madeline No with NetHope, and today we're welcoming representatives from the Carter Center and from Plan International to speak to us about how to get started with AI. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines for all of us today. We'd like you to keep this an interactive session. Please open your Zoom chat window, and if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat window. We'll curate those questions and have a Q&A session toward the end of the hour. Also look for a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this session and any collateral that we can provide as backup to the session today on the NetHope Solutions Center. And we would like to ask you to answer a webinar satisfaction poll that will pop up at the end of the session today in your browser. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Layla Toplik, who will introduce our speakers for today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Madeline. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'll do a quick introduction to this webinar series and also what we're hoping to do on this call. And there is an upcoming December 3rd webinar that's part of this series, and then bring up our speakers. So if we click to the next slide, this webinar is part of the next slide, please. So this webinar is part of the Emerging Technologies webinar series for those of you who are new to NetHope's Emerging Technologies initiative in our capacity building work, which includes these webinars and workshops. This initiative is specifically focused on growing nonprofit sectors' internal expertise and capacity to evaluate, to develop, to procure, and use emerging technologies like AI and blockchain in their work. And we've been focusing on 3 priorities this year on capacity building, so webinars like this one, on toolkits and standards, and also facilitating and activating support for practical implementations. Next slide. Those of you who didn't get a chance to join us at NetHope Summit, just wanted to give you some an overview of what we focused on at the summit and also how we're bringing some of the summit content and discussions to all of you in the NetHope community. At the summit, we focused our AI-specific capacity building around 4 areas based on the needs that our NetHope members and members of the AI working group have identified. First is the need to advance the understanding of the potential risks of applying and using AI and how to implement AI responsibly and ethically. And you'll be hearing a lot more about ethical AI in 2020 as we work on a practical guide for ethical AI for the international development sector. The second is really the need to get started without also having specialized expertise in AI and ML, and there are a number of off-the-shelf AI and ML tools and services from companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Salesforce that nonprofits can start exploring and experimenting with, and we'll actually bring this session to you as a webinar on December 3rd. The invite went out last night. If you haven't received it, let us know in the chat window, and Seth will share the invite to that webinar. Then there's also a need to learn practical implementations of AI in our sector, both field programs and also internal operations, and to be able to reuse and scale what works. And that's the topic covering today. And then lastly, nonprofits need to begin evaluating AI and ML for the specific problem statements that they're focusing on. And we also know that given that we're so early with using AI, understanding AI in our sector, and there's a lack of AI expertise in our sector, it's important to partner up and work with technology experts from private sector and academia. And at the summit, we had NGOs working together with technology subject matter experts from Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, and USAID. And some really interesting concepts emerged around the needs of children and youth, and specifically girls, emergency response, nature conservancy, and more. And we hope to host more of these hands-on sessions in 2020. In fact, If you want us to bring this type of hands-on session to your region or to your conference, let us know. Feel free to post in the chat window or to contact me directly, and I'll work with the leader of our AI working group, Steve Helen, to plan for that for 2020. So next slide. A couple of things as we get into this discussion about how to get started with AI. The first is, when we start talking about AI, the first two questions I typically get are, one, where do we see the potential of AI to deliver value? And the answer is, across all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, both field programs, so whether it's health, education, poverty alleviation, as well as internal operations, and also both incremental improvements to existing processes and programs, as well as creation of net new programs and solutions. The next slide. And then the second question is really around, what are some of the current examples of practical implementations of AI in our sector, and what can we learn from them? So on this slide, you see a couple examples, whether it's predicting food insecurity in Malawi, or early warning systems for earthquakes in Mexico, to preventing poaching wildlife with better park ranger routes, to detecting malaria. So just quite a range of interesting practical implementations that we all can learn from. Next slide. And that's exactly what we're going to focus on today, specifically lessons learned from two practical implementations, one from field programs and the other one from internal operations. Two NetHope members, Plan International and the Carter Center, will share how they're using AI in their work, including lessons learned across all stages of the process, from evaluating if AI is the right solution for the problem, to how to frame a problem for AI, get your data in order, resource teams, and also have the right processes in place to maintain and scale solutions. And then the final slide before I introduce Bo. As you begin evaluating AI for your work, if you click to the next slide, Madeline, what we'd like for you to do is to consider using questions from, slide back, if you could consider using questions from AI for Good framework to guide the process. So I'm just going to wait for the slide to show up so you have some of the sample questions. So this framework is a set of 32 questions that was designed to guide nonprofits and partners through the evaluation process to determine suitability of AI for international development, and then also to plan for sustainability, because we're seeing a number of pilots, but not much of that is actually scaling and sustaining. In terms of this framework, just a couple of points. One, it was developed through an iterative and consultative process with a very diverse group of stakeholders, global NGOs, USAID, academic institutions like MIT and University of California, Irvine, and also implemented in collaboration with our technology partners that participated in the hands-on sessions. And it was actually driven by the need of the nonprofit sector for practical tools that don't require specialized expertise in order to evaluate AI for our work. And you'll actually see us using this framework, and specifically these 8 questions that you see on this slide. Whenever we talk about lessons learned from practical implementations, including in this webinar, so you'll see Bo and Michael use these key 8 questions to share how they've evaluated AI for their specific problem statements and what they're learning. And then we're also using these questions when we do hands-on sessions. We plan to package up what is currently a Google spreadsheet into something that is a lot more user-friendly in 2020, and we'll make sure to share that with you. So with that, we'll transition into actually the lessons learned from 2 practical implementations. Next slide, and the first up is Bill Percival, who is the innovation lead for skills and opportunities for youth employment and entrepreneurship at Plan International. Bo, thank you so much for joining us. and look forward to everybody's questions. As a reminder, please post your questions in the chat window, and we'll get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of this webinar. Over to you, Bo.
Thanks very much, Layla. I'm just going to do a sound check before I jump into everything. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Layla, and yeah, and also for the for the mouthful of a title. We always joke about my title being kind of ridiculous. Essentially, what I work on at Plan is around innovations, digital, and young people. So whether that's entrepreneurship or employment. I think I should probably start with a few confessions. My first confession is that I'm not an AI expert. And I think this probably gives me a little bit of advantage of being able to be honest about what I don't know. I'm definitely not an AI black box. I am a real person despite the fact that I'm calling in. But I do really want to kind of be quite clear about that, because I'm not going to talk about the in-depths of the processing of particular AIs. In short, I guess I manage quite a few products and product owners. And so we came at this, and from my background, it's more about designing products rather than building AI. So we really approach this as we have a problem and we're looking for a solution. And AI wasn't necessarily like on everybody's lips at the time. It was kind of more about like, how are we going to solve this problem? So my next slide, please. So I'll also say too that with the introduction that Layla was giving about the framework there at the very end, a lot of that is I guess, in terms of preparation for using AI, and that's kind of, if you had a perfect world, then you would do the framework and you would understand how artificial intelligence works and whether or not it fits with what you're working on. But for us at Plan and with Tessa, we actually got this and retrofitted it to what we'd done. And I mean, part of me wishes we had had it earlier, but it was probably just a matter of timing and connections. So what I want to say is that if you already kind of started the path in your exploration of how AI can fit with solving your problem, don't think just because we're already on our way, the framework doesn't apply. It actually can really help identify some of the issues that you may have missed in the beginning, and it definitely did that for us. So yeah, diving right in, what I'm going to talk about here is the problem that we're trying to solve. So like I was saying, I work with youth and digital for Plan International, particularly around employment entrepreneurship. And for us, the problem that we were trying to solve is young women having a lot of skills, but not being able to effectively communicate them to link them to employment or entrepreneurship opportunities. That's kind of where we started. So we knew that like in the informal sectors, young women were developing a lot of skills, but when they put that on a resume, the resume ended up quite empty. And so therefore they weren't able to get jobs. That's kind of the short version of what we were looking at. So that's kind of where we started. Next slide, please. So the way that Plan currently does this, or used to do it, and we're in a process of transition at the moment, is what we call community development facilitators. And I should say that in what we're building with Tessa, we're not trying to replace our community development facilitators. Anyone who works with community workers typically understands that their capacity is always very thin because they've got about 1 billion hats that they're trying to wear at the same time. So what we're really looking is to like augment or support the work that's already being done. So what we do at the moment is we have community development facilitators that will work with individual young people, help them understand what skills they are, what they have, maybe help them develop a resume, and then look at partnerships that we might have in the community to say, okay, well, we've got these skills, you could go and work at this particular business or company that we have a partnership with. The thing that I really have always, and this is not just because I've drunk the Kool-Aid, but before working at Plan, something I've always respected about Plan is it's the quality of the work that Plan does. It typically comes with a higher price tag. It typically is a bit slower, but it's the depth of quality that I think really is something that we didn't want to lose. And so with this current approach is that we wanted to make sure that we took the quality of what we had and then extended that using artificial intelligence. And like I was saying before, it's not to replace, but to kind of support and augment and enhance, or any other of those various words you'd like to use. So the problem that we were really facing, in addition to like the core problem, was that we would love to be able to do more of what Plan does, but with our current model, every time we scaled up costs as well. So obviously that's not a very good model for scale. And therefore, if we wanted to reach the 1 billion young people that are about to enter the labor force in Asia, we just weren't going to be able to do it the way that we are doing it at the moment. Next slide, please. So, oh, sorry, just back one if you can, please. Great. Why is AI better than the current solution? I think AI adds to the current solution. And this is a really tough question for me because I've always been like a people first kind of product developer. And when we think about like, why is it better? I want to say, well, it's not better than people, but I think what we do is it allows our current approach to be better. Mainly when we look at the moment, Tessa's being deployed in the Philippines, a country with, I'm going to get this number wrong, but it's like 7,000 and something islands. And when the tide goes out, 7,100 apparently. So we've got a real issue with being able to stretch across geographies, being able to be flexible. To a young mother perhaps might have a child to look after, so they can't get to a training center or to meet one of our CDFs. And so AI kind of allows us to bridge some of these gaps that we have, and allows us to complement what we're currently doing, and then go to scale in a way that's actually effective, not just replicating the same thing over and again. This includes bringing automation, etc. So next slide, please. So what is our solution? So like I was saying, I'm not an AI expert. What we did here, and what I think is really important with anyone who's discovering this or taking on this journey and discovering how they can use AI, is to understand that like not everything has to be done from scratch and not everything has to be done by yourself. So we worked in partnership with Accenture and with a couple of other partners as well, and looked at what our problem was. And what we wanted to do was develop a chatbot, which kind of everybody's doing at the moment. And we understand it's not necessarily groundbreaking, but we wanted it to be less of a selling chatbot and more of a career coach. And so what we do, what Tessa does now is using NLP, and that's particularly the part of AI that we're leveraging at the moment, or natural linguistic programming for those who haven't come across it yet. Being able to have a conversation with young women particularly, and be kind of like a counsel or a coach. And Tessa, while it does stand for something that you saw at the beginning, the Training and Employment Service Assistant, I always get this one wrong. What Tessa really is we've given her the persona of an auntie, or in Tagalog it's an ate. We've developed it in Taglish, which is kind of a combination of Tagalog and English, and it's really there kind of as a counsel and a support, not just you should do this to get a job, but like, how can I help you do this thing? Next slide, please. So we've got two parts of Tessa now. One is about the conversation that we have, and that's understanding just data collection through through the young person that's using it, through the user. And we're gathering that data into a database so that we can do more with it in the future. The other part that we're looking at is how we can, once we've had this conversation with a young woman, understood what their skills are, and what their needs are, then how we can link that into current market trends or current opportunities. And this is where the other part of AI comes in for us. So it's understanding how we can find those skills and pick them out and then match them with potential opportunities. And while this has been happening for a very long time, just through like keyword matching and other pretty simple processes, we're now looking at ways that we can develop something that learns how to strengthen the likelihood of these connections becoming what we will call successful by either attaining a job or an interview or something along those lines. And this data is kind of coming through direct interaction with the app, and then linking it to other market databases that are out there. We've also recently just had a partnership with the Employment Ministry I'm just trying to think of what their acronym is in Philippines. And so they're also going to be feeding job data into it as well, which will allow us to kind of strengthen those connections. Next slide, please. So Layla mentioned something at the beginning about like trying to improve the sustainability of these AI interventions. And I think that was for us one of the biggest things that we overlooked. And you can see here on this list of the resources that we needed. When it started out, it was a team of about 6 or 7 Accenture developers that were based in the Philippines, plus a product owner from the UK and myself. And we all knew that at one point it would be given over to us, and that would be us being me, to handle essentially what a team of about 10 or 15 people had been doing. I think this is probably one of the questions that really deserves a lot of attention at the beginning of your process of discovery is what happens after it's successful, or like banking on the fact that it would be successful. Is it's really good to have an idea and to bring it to prototype and to be like, yeah, let's get this into the market. But as you can see here, we now have an exceptionally large team, and Haya, who's the product owner, and I joke about this, is that her team now is bigger than my team, even though she sits within my team, because she's got UX designers, she's got AI specialists, she's got lead developers, like mid-level, junior-level developers. Like a whole team now supports Tessa. So we've been fortunate enough to get a good amount of support from the organization and other places. But just keep this in mind, that when you're banking on success, because everyone wants what you're doing to succeed, how do you sustain that success over time? And I think that's something to kind of keep in mind, because it goes beyond just our technical, and I'll talk about this in a second, but also on the non-technical and incidental stuff that help keep this alive as well. Next slide, please. So the potential biases in AI, there's a lot of them. And I would like to say, as a gender transformative organization, those that know Plan know that we specifically look at improving the lives of young women, that we didn't make mistakes in this area. We should have been all over this. But as we kind of, as an organization, started to explore new things, being AI, we started to uncover these new areas of bias, particularly in relation to gender, that existed, that we kind of missed. And some of them are really simple and things that you might not think about. And I did a presentation at NetHope a couple of weeks ago, and I was perhaps too honest, because a lot of people said, oh, we really appreciated your honesty. But I think it's really useful to share that with everybody, because it started from day one. Like we had we were developing a product for young women, and yet our product owner and lead of the whole project were both men. The person that wrote our first conversation was a male that lived in the UK. And then when we had user testing, we'd try and get young women, but then often the young men would still turn up more so because they wanted to be involved. Our user experience teams were like this as well. So we really had to restructure everything. And I think when it comes to bias, don't assume that it won't creep in everywhere. That's probably my biggest learning here, is that we had this experience, and I'll talk about it in a second, but where even the avatar that we designed, you could tell was designed by a male, and it was very, challenging for a lot of young females to actually even get started in our product, even though that's where it started. So it was around the design, and as a designer, I kind of bang on about this a lot, but I think it's really important to note that if you don't design it correctly, fixing it is going to be a lot harder. And everything around like the bias, where data bias comes in, etc., will all start at the beginning. Because if you're using biased databases or data with bias in it, then you're only going to amplify that when you add any kind of automation to it. And this also comes in when a pretty straightforward example from what we've been doing is when an algorithm learns that young women are successfully placed in stereotypically female roles, like hairdressing, for example, that's a good connection to make. And by that very definition, it absolutely is. But this is kind of why we consider what we're doing at gender transformative technologies, because we need to disrupt that process. Because otherwise you teach an algorithm just to reinforce the biases that we've had all up until this point. Next slide, please. Actually, I think there was an animation on this slide, apologies, but it had the original version of what the avatar looked like originally, and now we brought in our new avatar, and this kind of signifies all our design. When we took on a human-centered design approach, we followed the textbook. I've been doing it for a while and know how it goes, and we kind of started to realize that, well, it's a good process, we were asking all the right questions in the wrong way. So asking like, what do you think a young auntie in the Philippines looks like is a very different question from who is the most inspirational female politician that you know, or like who in your, which female in your family inspires you to achieve your dreams or things like this. And so what we ended up using those kind of structured questions was that we were able to clean some of that bias out at the beginning, so that when we were designing it, it also set us up for the future. And we now use this thing called our principles for inclusion, which is the first thing that we do is we decide what are our principles and how are we going to make sure that these are carried through the entire process from design to deployment and then follow up. Next slide, please. Our maintaining the solution, we originally started with Accenture. It was not something that we were able to maintain. We scaled everything back as simple as possible, but now we have a bigger team that allows us to manage this. We are able to continue leveraging some support from our partners, either Accenture, we've got some partnerships with Microsoft, and this allows us to kind of to keep on moving forward. I think what we've always tried to do is maintain our solution at a level where everything additional, like the Accenture, the Microsoft partnerships and others, allow us to go beyond what we would plan for. So we plan for like a skeleton and then try and build upon that, and it kind of seems like a bonus. So we can keep the lights on and then see how we can grow. We're doing a lot more work now in maintaining our solution in serverless architecture, making sure that we're being more proactive about our response to things, proactive about our approach to things rather than responding, and really looking at, taking it to the next level, which fortunately we're able to do at the moment. Next slide, please. So where we're kind of at the moment, we've been kind of connecting with different partners to look at how we can strengthen our architecture. Tessa actually links into a bigger ecosystem of products that we have at plan for young people. That includes online learning products, linkages to jobs and those kind of things. So Tessa interacts with all of those products. And we're currently moving, like I was just saying, moving on to a serverless architecture to make sure that we can scale a lot quicker and be a little bit more responsive. We're expanding the features. So over the next 12 months, we're looking at being more inclusive. So working with some partners, Microsoft included, to increase the inclusion of our specific products, particularly for people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or may have some sight impairments. And looking at how we can bring voice into that. And then what we're also doing is looking for other partners at the moment that can bring technical expertise. So we kind of have a crew that runs the product very well and does the product lifecycle quite well. But we want to know what we don't know. And that's where we're really looking at connecting with a lot of technical experts and augmenting our staff with these people to really, like I was saying earlier, take Tessa to a new level where it can provide the support to the young people that we're working with, but also go beyond our own borders. The other thing that we would like as well is that our team is quite young and fresh, not in terms of like young age, but in experience with AI. We have a few experts in there, but we're really looking at how we can bring all of those people on, particularly in relation to the areas of AI and other kind of automation and machine learning. So yeah, that's kind of our very brief journey so far, and happy to take a couple of questions later on as well.
Great, thank you so much, Bo. Just a couple of notes here before we transition into the example of how AI is being used for internal operations. A couple of things. One is, as you heard from Bo, it's really important to evaluate all the tools that are available to you, whether you are a technologist or a program expert. In this case, Bo really represents programs, somebody who is more of an expert in the engagement with, and covering the needs of children and youth, and find the partners who can help augment your expertise. Second, also Bo shared how you might consider using tools like AI to augment the current solutions that might not be delivering, for example, the reach that you need. And then hopefully answered a couple of questions about what do you need to have in place in order to make this successful. And one of the areas that we tend to focus on quite a bit in the lessons learned, but also in the framework, is data. Having enough high quality, meaningful data that can really help you deliver the right solution, and being able to maintain and also refresh the data sets. So thank you for all the questions that are coming through. We'll get to as many as possible, either during the Q&A, or we can also follow up offline after the webinar. So the next up, if you click to the next slide, Madeline, is really an example of how one of our members is using AI internally and specifically to augment the work that they're already doing. And for that, we have Michael Schultz, who's the program associate for the Syria conflict mapping at the Carter Center, who will actually take us to the same 8 questions and share with you the lessons learned from this specific implementation. Over to you, Michael.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. My name is Michael Schultz, and I'm a program associate with the Syria conflict mapping team at the Carter Center. Before I dive into our AI application and our data management, I'd like to give a really brief introduction to our project. The Syria conflict mapping team started in 2013-2014, mapping the formation of armed groups in Syria as soldiers were defecting from the military and new groups were announcing themselves. And we began tracking their formations, their mergers, whenever they ceased to exist. And what that led us to do was collect conflict information to verify their activity, and also collect what we referred to as areas of control data, where we had point locations all across Syria that we mapped the military authority that controlled that location at the first of every month from the beginning of 2014 onward. And that's actually what brings me to this graph that you can see on the first slide. And each one of those points is a point location in Syria. And you can see that you have the military authorities of the government, opposition forces, the Islamic State, and the Kurdish forces. And all the links that those centroids share with each point suggest that at some point during the conflict, that authority controlled one of those point locations. And so ultimately, this is kind of giving a narrative of the conflict, where you can see that many of the locations that were exchanged between the government and the opposition, those outnumbered those that the government exchanged with the Islamic State. And you can see that the Kurdish forces largely exchanged territory with the Islamic State. And so you can see how the conflict over time has developed and who has been fighting whom so far. Next slide. Some of the ways that one of the ways I like to conceptualize the AI applications in the NGO sphere so far are kind of AI forward programming. Things like what Bo just presented, where you have the programming where the AI is very much visible and it's apparent that you're using AI to accomplish your programming. And then maybe secondarily, there is this AI for classification or data management, or these internal processes where at the end product, the reports that we write for our project, it wouldn't be immediately apparent that you would see AI in our reports. Really, we use it to support what we were already doing internally and to increase the capacity of our team to accomplish better analysis and to do more analysis on the Syrian conflict in a timely manner. Next slide. Largely, the problem that we've been trying to solve over many years in our project is actually a project that we think, or is a problem that is inherent to conflict data, in that the data is rarely standardized, and is oftentimes irregular. And that's something that is inherent to conflict, where you have different reporting networks across a whole country or across a whole conflict. Sometimes you have different languages, you have different formats the data arrives in. And so there is a significant amount of effort that NGOs go to standardize this data for in conflict settings. And it requires a lot of staff time on teams that are oftentimes hurting for staff time to accomplish our tasks. But more specifically for the AI implementation I'm presenting today, the specific problem we were trying to accomplish involves these points that you can see on the map here on the right. And those are the original 5,771 UN locations for Syria that were identified for providing in-depth analysis and for humanitarian support in the conflict. And whenever these locations were identified, our project began attributing the areas of control property that I discussed earlier with the first graph to each of these points. And so at the beginning of every single month, we would determine who controls that point. And we kept keeping track of that information. However, halfway through the conflict, the UN decided that the original 5,700 or so locations were insufficient for providing the necessary support and analysis on the conflict. And so they added about 2,000 new locations. At the time, our team was low on staff time, and we had fewer staff than we have now even. And it was deemed impossible for us to backdate and update all that information. And so we just kept maintaining the original 5,771 locations, but didn't go back and attribute those things to the new locations. Unfortunately, this meant with each month that we went by, this task became a larger and larger task and became more impossible for just our team to take on alone in light of all of our ongoing activities. Next slide. How we would have addressed this without AI is that we'd have, as many as 2 members of our staff and 3 interns spend almost full time on this until they completed it, using Excel to update the information and plotting the points, the latitude and longitudes on Google Earth Pro, and coloring each point for each reporting period based on who controlled it. So we'd load in 1 month at a time and then plot the points that we didn't know yet, and then we would infill based on what things were adjacent to it, as well as institutional knowledge that many people on our project have developed over many years of staring at the data that comes in about the conflict. Many times we can infill the information just on our knowledge, but that takes time. And so for the 1,909 new locations for the 59 reporting periods at the time whenever we were attempting to accomplish this, we've discovered that we had 117,725 values to infill across our entire data set. For those of you who are good at mental math, you'll realize that that doesn't add up, and that we should have fewer than that for the 1,909 new locations. However, we also discovered that there were many missing values within the original 5,771 locations as well. So we had a lot of work to do to update and standardize our areas of control location. And what we were finding is that if we took a minute on average to review each of these values, which might even be a little bit optimistic, it would have been nearly 2,000 hours of work in total to do this manually, which we just did not have the capacity or manpower to accomplish at the time. Next slide. So what we decided to do to simplify the task was to implement potentially the most simple AI model out there, but thankfully it's also one of the easiest to visualize because it's only a 2-dimensional K nearest neighbors classification model that we use to update our controlled by attribute for all of the new locations. You can see that this is kind of what those maps look like for each month. The map that you see here on the screen is from May of 2016. And you can see that yellow is the Kurdish forces, black are Islamic State, red government, and green is opposition. And these locations are what we were using to determine what the new locations would be. Next slide. And what I mean when I say that is a k-nearest neighbors classification model identifies an assigned number of nearest points where we have a known value, a known classification for those points. And it then takes those and gives a probability that the point you are looking for is a certain classification. So given the location of Magic World, which I think if we click once, it should have an animation that comes up. There we go. Magic World, which is actually a real place in Syria. It's a former amusement park and zoo that unfortunately found itself on the front lines of Idlib in 2016. And so if we were to say that the 3 nearest points we were going to use to predict the classification for this point, we'd see that 2 of those 3 nearest points were controlled by opposition forces. And so a 3 nearest neighbors classification model would give it a 66% probability that this new point was controlled by opposition forces. However, if we increase those points to 7, we see that the 7 nearest neighbors classification model now suggests that this point has a 57% chance of being controlled by the government instead of opposition. So it gives you an idea of how assigning a different nearest neighbors total can give you a different probability, and it also drives home the point that this doesn't tell us much about who controlled Magic World in reality. The probabilities are really close to 50%. However, whenever you find points that are behind front lines that have 100% of 7 nearest neighbors, suggesting that that should be controlled by opposition, we can be fairly confident that that point is controlled by opposition forces. Next slide. So what we found is that we had a significant reduction of effort if we used that 100% threshold. And so we ended up with, instead of the 117,000+ values to infill, we only had 26,000 only. And that ended up being a 77% reduction in the number of values to infill. So we went down to about 400 hours of work from nearly 2,000. And we used a 7 nearest neighbors model to produce the predicted values. And we had an error rate of about 1 to 2% if I was using cross-validation with the original data set. And that's what we used to identify the number of neighbors, because this gave us the lowest error rate. And we did arrive at a 1 to 2% error rate with that 100% probability. And those locations were something that we actually expected to find incorrectly classified with this methodology. There are a few places that I would refer to as kind of like islands of control, where the government of Syria might control an airbase that was surrounded by Kurdish forces or opposition forces, and that we were aware of those locations. And so many of those errors we actually were expecting to find and immediately went in and changed because we knew they would be there. Next slide. So the kinds of data we needed for this approach was relatively simple, actually, because we only needed, of the complete location list, latitude, longitude, and the community name. So these are for the locations that we were going to be infilling with the k-nearest neighbors model. And then for the original 5,771 locations, which is kind of like the training set, if you will, needed to have a control by property for each period that we were going to be building a model. So ultimately, this actually was 59 individual models that were trained, but that was actually very simple to do because it was really just looping through and producing a new model each time we had a month to predict on the new set. So really, this helped us a lot because, as I said earlier, our conflict information is very difficult to prepare for analysis. And so with this approach, we were able to prepare another aspect of our data set that was unprepared previously, the control by property, by only preparing 3 other or 4 other aspects of our data: the latitude, longitude, community name, and the control by properties for the original locations. So instead of having to clean all of our data all at once, we were able to actually use a simple AI approach to getting us a little bit closer to doing more complex analysis in the future. Next slide. So the resources that we used to do this were all open source. And so that was actually one of our goals to start with. And it does raise the bar in terms of needing a little bit of technical expertise. And so there needs to be a little bit of an understanding of some simple AI approaches, just like the k-nearest neighbors model, understanding how regression works. There's a number of different kind of simple classification models that have open source packages in R or modules in Python that you can use to implement. We were able to develop these skills in-house by relying on online resources through professional development and having team members who were interested in learning. And this allowed us to pursue AI, simple AI, without having an outlay of financial outlay that made it difficult to get approval within our own organization. And so while this has a little bit of a learning curve that might be a little bit difficult, particularly if you don't have a lot of the technical capacity in your team right now, one of the things that we've realized is that just by accomplishing anything in AI successfully, we've been able to market more effectively to our upper management about, okay, this is what we need, this is what we want. We've been able to do this in the past successfully. We can't accomplish this on our own anymore. And so it's been nice to build credibility within our own organization, but it did take a little bit of time up front. Next slide. And when it comes to the biases that this process might have, and it's very similar to a lot of conflict data, is that we have geographic and political bias of our information. And so within the Syrian context, events that occur in certain areas of the country, particularly those that are more highly populated or are under the control of forces that are more open to media reporting, we oftentimes get more reports. And so we have more complete reporting from those areas and less complete reporting from other areas. And so we always have to be aware of that whenever we're adjusting our control by property, because oftentimes we may underrepresent how contested an area has been because we haven't been hearing about it. And there was actually an incident of this a little while ago when the Islamic State actually took control of a village in central Syria for about 5 days. And we completely missed it because we didn't hear about it for 2 weeks until 2 weeks later. And then when it comes to political bias, it's very similar. If you have reporting from certain areas of the country where there's more tight political control of the media, you're likely to hear a certain kind of narrative, and it's exactly the opposite in different areas. And then different sources of information have their own political bias. And so we always have to be very careful about which sources we are relying on for certain kinds of information, because they're going to portray whether or not opposition forces have captured a region or not in a different light. And so it might be very difficult for us to determine whether or not something has actually changed hands, or if it was very brief, or what the nature of the conflict might be. And so that's oftentimes some of the difficulties we have in terms of bias in this context. Next slide, please. So when it comes to maintaining our solution, I think one of the things that differentiates oftentimes the internal approach to AI and maybe some of these AI forward projects is that the models we built for this solution were kind of disposable, because they were meant to accomplish a task once that we'd never have to do again, and that we'd actually keep up with our data after this, but this helped us get there. So we're never going to be revisiting the specific models that we built for this and the specific tool that we built for this. However, maybe to put a plug in for the AI framework through NetHope. That's really what I view the solution is within our team, is that now that we have a little bit of this technical capacity to apply simple AI models, it is approaching new problems, realizing that it is an option, but it's not always the correct solution. So whenever we have another problem where we have this deep dive problem that we need to do once and accomplish and then be done with, we can evaluate it using the AI framework and making sure that we're disciplined in our approach to applying AI and machine learning tools. So I think that's really our approach to maintaining the solution, is just maintaining the methodology of approaching each new task with the intent of potentially using AI if it's appropriate, or not using it if it's not appropriate. Next slide, please. And now, a more advanced version of this internal operations application of AI, we currently have a partnership with Microsoft to develop a conflict event classification tool that is capable of classifying an event with multiple tags. And so a lot of our information comes from the open source, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLID. I know many of you are familiar with them, as they produce fantastic amounts of data and really good quality across many contexts. But one of the things that the ACLID dataset does, I think, to improve accuracy and to improve consistency more so, is that they will only provide one classification for what an event is. So in the Syrian context, we often have events where you have an aerial bombardment, shelling, and armed clashes between groups all happening in what they're referring to as the same event. But ACLID has an event hierarchy, so that we have aerial bombardment might be at the top of that hierarchy, so that's the only thing it's going to be coded as. But if you read the comments, you realize that other things occurred at the same time. And so right now, Microsoft is helping us develop a NLP tool to understand when there is a multiple classification and to apply that classification. The version 1 of this model was limited to a certain number of event types that we had a better training set for, but we're preparing more as we go. And that model was capable of accurately suggesting multiple event types whenever necessary. And so we're hopeful that version 2 of this tool will allow us to spend even less time doing manual data manipulation and doing more time doing analysis. And I think that's it from my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much.
But the call to action is really just if your organization is interested in AI, engage with the NetHope AI working group and start talking to other people who have tried to use AI to improve their data processing, because there are lessons learned out there, and there are different organizations at different stages in their development. And I know that all of us are willing to help out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. And I'm glad you got to the call to action slide. So if we just click to the next slide. So a couple of things just on this last point from Michael. If you are a NetHope member and interested in learning more about AI use cases and practical implementations, and if you have any practical implementations you'd like to share, you're invited to join NetHope AI working group. If you're a partner, technology expert interested in exploring ways to collaborate, please do email me. You have my email in this chat window, and we'll also share that in the recap email. Just 2 points before I quickly jump into we'll only take about 2 questions and then follow up actually on other questions in writing. So we will answer all of your questions. One note here on specifically what Michael presented is really highlighting how you can use very simple AI to improve existing processes, especially internally, and the importance of trying something small first that is meaningful enough so that the initial successes will help your organization gain familiarity with AI and also support the work of the organization. Unlike what Bo presented, which was creation of a net new solution to augment an existing program. And then the other difference is that the Carter Center had internal resources dedicated to this incremental solution, while Plan International had the expertise specific to the problem that they're trying to solve, but went outside of the sector to find partners who had technical expertise. So that would be also a call to action to those of you who don't have technical expertise, is to partner for expertise, for resources, and also for a greater impact. So 2 quick questions, one for Bo, one from Michael, and then we'll follow up on the rest. And then also you have our emails here if you want to ask any additional questions. So Bo, just a question to really clarify the role of AI. If you can really give a few specific examples of the kind of insights that AI specifically generates from the data that you could not have some other manual analysis to be done. And also if you can just quickly explain the technology stack and specific AI capabilities.
Yeah, okay. I'll be as quick as I can with those 3 questions. So linking with the question about like the value of AI and what we're actually doing. So where we're really looking at is just, and you hit the nail on the head, Layla, when you said augmenting, it's augmenting what we already do. So the value add AI for us is that if you look at it from the perspective of a community development facilitator, it takes them 30 minutes to have an interview with a young person, maybe another 30 to 40 minutes to take that information and put it into some kind of format, and then the resume is produced. Then it might take them another 30 minutes to connect with a partner. So where we've brought AI in to augment that process is all of that process, the interview, the translation into skills, and then the connection to the job market, is all done using different forms of AI. So we're using NLP, and the stack that we're using, there was a question there I saw as well, which I can bring into this, is like what we use to train the model. We, like I said at the beginning, we didn't develop anything here. We're leveraging Google Dialogflow. The stack then is just built with a bunch of containers to help us connect that API to Facebook. So we're running this message on Facebook services. And then we have our own database that is collecting the information there. Now, the insights that we're getting from this and how our value is there is that what we're looking to do is either validate information that is already in the market or to uncover new insights that don't exist in the market. Because when it comes to young people finding jobs, the biggest issue is that training centers train young people for things that don't actually exist. And so the data that we have can show what jobs are coming into our databases, and we can uncover the trends on skills, and then what young people should be training for, and then we connect them to training opportunities in that sense. So what we're really looking at doing there is like going beyond what the government tells us, what the training centers tell us and everything, and looking at what young people are actually being trained in, and then what's actually being demanded in the market. And those 2 things more often than not don't link up. And that's what we're trying to do with the data that we have and the further insights that we're gaining. The other thing that we're moving towards as well is, like I said at the very beginning.
Bo, I'm going to have to cut you off, and then we'll follow up with a lot more detailed response to both excellent questions in writing, which you'll receive in your recap email. Just one quick question for Michael, and again, we'll provide a lot more detail, is what did your training process for the algorithm look like, Michael?
So I think I glossed over it a little bit to fit time, but the training process for the Canadian Service algorithm was based on all of our known information, because we maintained that original set of control by properties for the 5,771 locations. So that was our training set, and then the prediction, the actual set that we were going to be using to predict on were the new locations added by the UN about halfway through the conflict. And so because we kind of, I wouldn't say arbitrarily, but just as a way to standardize our areas of control by property, what we did is we had a new property at the first of every month from 2014 onwards. And so whenever we had tried to do this task, we had 59 of these individual dates where we had actually collected a control by property for every single location. And so what we did is really built 59 individual 7 nearest neighbors models to classify all of those new locations for each reporting period, all 59 reporting periods. And so that's what the training looked like. And I used R to do it just because I'm more comfortable in R than anything else. And so it was just separating, reshaping the data into those reporting periods, and then training the algorithm again and again and again and again, training the model again and again, and then predicting using that new model each time for each reporting period. And so that's what the process looked like. I hope that was addressed your question.
Thank you so much, Michael. And again, there's some really fantastic questions. It really shows the interest from this group in understanding the work that you're doing. So what we'll do, which is what we typically don't do for these webinars, but given the great questions, we will follow up in writing and respond to as many questions as possible. And yes, the recording of this webinar will be available. And then also the slides. We noticed that Zoom distorted some of the excellent slides that Michael and Bo have put together, but you will have access to the PDF for all of the slides. And then you also have direct contact for all of us. I do want to thank Bo and Michael for sharing their work both at the recent NetHope Global Summit, but now also with the broader NetHope community, and talking very openly and transparently about some of the challenges as well as some of the opportunities related to AI, both for the field programs and internal operations. Thank you very much to you and to your organizations, Plan International and the Carter Center. If you have any practical implementations of AI that you would like to share with this community, do send me an email, as Steve, Helen, and I are putting together a potential webinar list for the 2020, and would love to hear from you. So thanks for that. Madeline, over to you for the survey.
Thank you, Layla. Thanks to all of our attendees for today's session. Please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction poll that will pop up after you close the Zoom window, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.